Hello, and welcome to this conversation on the trouble with uncertainty. My name is Giovanni de Grandis. I am the coordinator of the AFINO project, and I am based at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Trondheim. Today, I am very pleased to have with me Arthur Petersen. Arthur Petersen is Professor of Science, Technology and Public Policy at the Department of Science, Technology, Engineering and Public Policy at University College London. Besides working for UCL, Arthur has held, or still has, appointments at several other prestigious universities, among which the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the London School of Economics and Political Science, the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, and Osaka University. Recently, he was also elected as a member of the Academia Europaea, the European Academy of Humanities, Letters and Sciences. But Arthur also has a very extensive experience outside academia. He was scientific advisor on environment and infrastructure policy within the Dutch government. He served as chief scientist on the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. He has been for almost 20 years a member of the Dutch government delegation to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, also known as IPCC. And he is also professorial fellow at the Dutch National Institute for Public Health and the Environment. Besides this massive experience, Arthur is also a polymath. He has a PhD in atmospheric sciences, one in the philosophy of science, and one that is about to get in the philosophy of religion. So he's almost the last of the Renaissance men. And today he is with us to talk about the topic on which most of his work, both as a researcher and as an advisor, has focused, namely dealing with uncertainty. His work has consistently been at the interface between science and policy, and his latest interests include how to do science-informed policy in non-Western settings and on what kind of critique of science is afforded by religion. So, welcome, Arthur, and thank you very much for being with us today. And I would like to start by asking you a slightly personal question. I would like you to tell us what was your most formative experience in working on uncertainty. And then I would like you to tell us how did you come to see what was the contribution that you wanted to bring through your research and policy advice. In short, what would you like to be able to contribute and why do you think it is important?
Well, hello. Thanks, Giovanni, for the very nice introduction and for inviting me here. You're asking about formative experiences, and I think they came in waves from, let's say, first being an undergrad physics student and doing error analysis, and then you think you can handle uncertainty in your experiment because you have an error bar, up to, well, later doing atmospheric physics and chemistry and doing computer simulations of the atmosphere and entering a very interesting debate with others in terms of how reliable are those simulations. I claimed, and I still think it's true, that those specific simulations were more reliable than anything you could do on the interaction of turbulence and chemistry in a laboratory setting. But the question is open, of course, on that one. But there I felt that uncertainty is not a negative thing. It's a positive resource in science for progress and for discussion on what are the interesting questions and what are best methods to get further in the exploration of the unknown. But then what happened a few years later is I was hired by the Dutch government as a civil servant at the science policy interface to help their institution on environmental assessment in dealing with uncertainty after a huge crisis in environmental policymaking in the Netherlands on the use of models. There was a discussion in the 90s. It was happening in the US, it was happening in the Netherlands. There was a kind of conclusion that environmental policies are unreliable because they are based on models and it shouldn't be allowed. Now, you always have to rely on models, even if you do measurements, but that's another philosophy of science discussion. But the question is, of course, what are the specific uncertainties? What are the issues? And there were some specific issues with measurements being replaced by models, which led to larger uncertainties in estimates of emissions of particular and concentrations of particular gases. But what I learned there is I worked with the Dutch government, within the Dutch government and stakeholders to develop a policy analysis tool to deal with all aspects related to uncertainty. So that was really formative in terms of dealing with stakeholders, indicators, questions on gaps in knowledge, and then finally coming to questions on how to best communicate about uncertainty. The final kind of formative experience was in an episode in 2010, when I was working within the Dutch government with a team to investigate all the errors. I was charged with finding all the errors in the IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. There was a huge outcry in 2009, 2010, and I ended up doing an investigation for the Dutch minister and Dutch parliament on specifically one of the working group reports of the IPCC. And what we discovered there was not so much errors were the issue, but the untraceable expert judgment that went into their main conclusions. So I learned from that even though the main conclusions stood strongly, we couldn't find the underpinning of those main conclusions in those reports, because they were made by teams of authors who brought their expert judgment, and they're the best experts in many cases. They brought their judgments together and they came to a conclusion. So I learned from that it's important to realize the reliability on expert judgments, and that's what I've been working on with people like Lenny Smith from the London School of Economics, where we published the Lawrence principles on how you communicate about models and their reliability. You have to be really aware of all the assumptions that are made there, and if a model is fit for purpose, if you give science advice on the basis of that. You're on mute, Giovanni.
That's very interesting, and it's especially fascinating to see how expert judgment can enter into the production of important documents. And of course, this in some cases is perfectly sound, and but I can see how it can create problems in giving the evidence backing these opinions. So uncertainty seems to be sometimes not only about the figures, but also about how you account for some results, for some conclusions, right?
And that's exactly the lesson I learned. So I thought uncertainty was about error bars and reliability intervals and things like that. And I learned it was about the qualitative underpinning of why you think a method is reliable, and discussions about that. And of course, both are important, right? You still have to have your quantitative measures of uncertainty ranges. But the crux of the matter is in what you could call the pedigree, which is part of what Silvio Fantovic and Jerry Raffetz developed their NUSAP methodology, where the pedigree is what's the underpinning qualitatively, methodologically of your conclusions, and what methods to use.
So it's also a question of transparency and of making explicit what has gone in the production of the results. Yes,
and there are limitations to that. So it's not really possible necessarily to make every step in your expert judgment transparent. And it's even more important to be reflexive about there being this role of expert judgment. And there must be an awareness that not everything is, let's say, you cannot make everything explicit, but you have to try as a group to make explicit those assumptions that you think have an implication in policy advice, for instance. So in the normal practice of science, you typically don't go very far in terms of making explicit your reasoning, as long as your peer community accepts a particular claim because you use methods that they think are sound. But so you have to go one step further in making some things in your practice of science more explicit, And often it's the case that for particular high-stake decisions, ordinary kind of practice in science isn't good enough. It doesn't produce information that's reliable enough for making the kind of decisions that you have to make. You have to learn how to flag that and to kind of raise red flags in terms of, for your kind of decision, you cannot really rely on this information. It's the best that we have, but the best that we have is not good enough for making decisions sometimes.
So, in a sense, one big problem comes from not only the methods but also the context in which they are used and the questions that they are used to answer. So some methods are perfectly sound in some circumstances for some purposes, but when you move them outside certain areas, then they start to show their limits, right?
Yeah, that's exactly the point I'm getting at. This decision-making context, which offers new questions for experts in terms of digging into the basis of their expertise and digging into the validity of their methods.
I think we have almost already answered what was my following question, that was about the sources of uncertainty and why they are so difficult to be acknowledged and to be accounted for. So what do you think is the main challenge in this respect when scientists use predictive models?
I would go back to the point I made about the difficulty of becoming reflexive about expert judgment. And in the case of models, it's expert judgment on the structure of the models and their, let's say, domain of validity, because you often extrapolate outside of what you've been able to kind of test your models for. Because we move to some unknown futures. We have some past for which we can check whether the models can explain the past, but for instance, also in climate change, we're moving into new territory and you don't always know if the models actually are credible for those different situations. So in terms of sources of uncertainty, this is really about where do the structures of the models come from, the assumptions in the model, and it's often very hard to determine when is a model valid or not. And this will often be a point for continuing debate.
Yeah, I say that this is probably one of those things that will be debated for a long time. Now, moving to a slightly different issue. So, uncertainty is a great challenge when scientists design research, but also and perhaps even more when they communicate research. In your experience and in your opinion, what makes scientists not good enough in communicating uncertainty, and what makes policymakers a difficult audience for the communication of uncertainty?
Yeah, here, what makes things difficult both for the scientist and for the policymaker, and I would distinguish a third category of the politician. So we may have those three different groups which have different roles. So the policymaker may think, I want to build science-informed decisions that are proposed to the politicians to kind of sell and kind of get their political groups behind to make those choices. And what sometimes is thought is if we diminish the talk about uncertainty, it's easier to make difficult decisions. And the weird thing is that's typically not the case. If we have to take, like in the financial crisis, everybody knew that nobody knew what was happening, and economics was out of their depth in terms of explaining what was happening. But they had to take huge decisions with huge stakes. And of course, politics is making decisions under uncertainty. That's the essence. So we get back to the discussion in the 1990s and the 90s and the pushback against environmental policy making. There the argument is often used by people against environmental policies that the knowledge is not reliable enough and there are too many uncertainties and we cannot move forward. And sometimes in reaction to that, I think what may go wrong is that scientists become politicians and policymakers without saying it. So you have these kind of stealth advocates. So they are overly, let's say, strong in their statements because they really believe what they have found, and they may be completely right on that count. But then they can be caught out in terms of, well, what are you doing? You are kind of suppressing the assumptions, and then people start thinking there may be something on purpose and maybe something wrong. This is part of the discussion on this hockey stick, height the decline, which was in ClimateGate. There was a legitimate concern about some methodological questions on things like tree rings and how they respond to recent changes. And then there was a kind of decision, let's hide this uncertainty, let's not show it. Well, you had the backlash because then people think you're hiding something real, which wasn't the case. So there was a kind of, should have been a warning sign in the climate science side that being honest about your assumptions and limitations pays off in the long time. But you need for that politicians who don't want to hide behind scientific certainty. So you need those two different groups to do a dance together. The politicians being willing to acknowledge that they have to make a decision or propose a decision to a public if they are up for elections under huge uncertainty, but still with a guiding vision on where they want society to go. For instance, with sustainable development, we don't know a lot of details, but we do know some big things, and we do want particular transformations to happen. But they shouldn't just say, because scientists say this is certain, we should do that. Which is difficult, but it is possible, and there are examples for that. So this is the, it's a difficulty on both sides. For the scientists to be humble, but still give relevant information. And for the policymakers to be kind of in between in terms of preparing the policies and executing the policies that in the end the politicians have to decide on, where they have to be explicit as well on some weaknesses in the knowledge base, but also risks of not taking decisions, right? That's also a decision taken under uncertainty. So it's all about how you legitimate decision-making. That has always been decision-making under uncertainty. So politics is always getting a group behind you for moving the society in a particular direction, using this scientific information as a very important input. And that's a fine balance. So some scientists may have kind of get an identity from I'm the one who knows everything and I can tell you what to do. And there's a risk in relying too much on people who want to play that kind of role.
Yeah, definitely. And we have seen also some example recently. But I think it's very interesting also what you said about politics, because yeah, of course, politics is the art of making decisions under uncertainties and decisions that affects quite deeply other people's lives. So, of course, if you can justify your decisions with the authority of science and certainty, you can sort of move the blame for any unpalatable consequences away from you. But when there is...
And that's the hope.
Yeah.
That's the hope maybe of some politicians. But in the end, that will backfire. I think it's good to show that you let yourself be informed by the most credible science that we have. So I'm absolutely not pleading in any way against that. But it's also about making clear who has the responsibility to weigh everything up.
Yeah, and probably there is also a need from the public of being a little more prepared to accept that errors can be made in good faith sometimes. It's not always a matter of incompetence or corruption or party interest. There are things that...
Yeah, and that is difficult, and you need a particular style of leadership for that. People who are willing to admit that they may have been wrong.
But let's come back to scientists. So in my perception, as a non-expert in this field, I see that when it comes to acknowledging the limitations of the results, scientists might have problems that are both internal to science, as it were, and external to science. And what I mean is that scientists may easily overlook some of the gaps and the limits in their favorite methods and frames, on the one hand. And on the other hand, like every other human being, they have their own interests, biases, and values. So do you think that these two sources of blindness to limits and biases can be addressed together, or do you think that they need to be tackled at different levels and with different methods?
Well, I think my short answer on the question whether they can be tackled together is yes, but they are different. So to discuss one of these issues, I think it's important to realize that science is a social practice. You cannot do science on your own. And part of that practice is being scrutinized, offering claims for scrutiny by a scientific community. That's the whole idea of peer review. And that's still a very crucial central element of the practice of science. And in that peer review, you need extended peer review in the sense that people working from different perspectives also have to scrutinize particular claims and models and their validity. And that means in the end that you have to acknowledge that in the choices that you make within the scientific practice itself, there are values that you assume either coming from your discipline or even metaphysical values or practical values or even political values sometimes that implicitly guide your scientific daily practice. And you have to, and that's not illegitimate, you just have to, within the practice of science, have to organize sufficient critique so that some of those assumptions may surface and other assumptions may be put against that, and then there's a larger set of results that you must look at. Now, I am not kind of a determinist that thinks that the social determines the science. So there is a whole stream, of course, typically started in the 1970s of the interests in a way explaining why people take particular positions in science. And I don't think it's as simple as that. It's much more complex in terms of what are the different influences that influence individual choices and how practices unfold. But definitely there are many factors playing a role in people's individual choices and judgments and next steps and claims in the end that they put up for scrutiny. And you can be very blind for your own assumptions. In the end, I think you need different methods to find for maybe a whole field that it has particular assumptions. So we've looked at, there's very basic questions in terms of how you build precautionary principle into your scientific practice. So you have toxicologists who have done some of that. There's all sorts of factors, safety factors that fold into the practice itself. And then versus, for instance, epidemiologists that may have a different take on when do they have a signal that's strong enough to kind of say that there's an issue with a particular compound. I'm talking about toxic substances. So this is one example where very basic societal values are ingrained in how a particular science is done. We see it also in the IPCC, what I learned from the study in the errors, a difference between working group 1, the physical scientists, and working group 2, the ecologists, where working group 1, the scientists don't want to be seen to be overselling or dramatizing. They are too cautious. So the real climate change will definitely be worse than whatever they will ever paint in working group 1. That's my strong claim, but I really sincerely believe that. There's a self-restraint also in reaction to earlier kind of issues, but it's coming from the physical sciences and how they want to be erring on the side of the carefulness, while ecologists don't want to risk overlooking any risk. So in that sense, Working Group 2 has a very different approach. Every error that was made in Working Group 2 was in the direction of exaggerating the problem of climate change and not in the other direction. And so that's again, I'm not saying this is wrong, because we do need these societal perspectives informing how the different disciplines work. But you have to become aware of it once things become very much politicized. So you have to be able to deal with it better than the IPCC, for instance, has been able to reflect on that fact itself.
So do you think that in the end, a certain level of partiality or subjectivity is inevitable, but in a way even healthy in science, because by having different values, different orientation, people ask different questions and bring out different elements of reality, of the truth, and what we need is a good and open pluralism with this difference of perspective are challenged and have to confront different perspectives and therefore sort of be mediated and moderated in their partiality.
So yes, that is my view, but it is not easy to organize this kind of deeper reflection if it's about whole disciplines, right? Sometimes you can just get things published because everybody does it that way, and then some things don't get challenged. So only once you are having a more extended peer review, those things can get into sight.
It's also a problem of having the right arenas to do this kind of exercise. Okay, but now let me move to my next question. So I think that in recent times there has been a lot of attention on the uncertainties of scientific knowledge and scientific advice. But what about the uncertainties that lie on the other side, on the consumption of knowledge, as it were, rather than in the production of knowledge? Do you think that there has been enough attention on understanding what affects how scientific advice is received and used? Is your work on scientific advice in non-Western setting a step in this direction?
So let me start with highlighting that question, which is more the question of societal aspects of dealing with uncertainty. That's actually what was my charge when I started working for the Dutch government in 2001. It was exactly that from the start, dealing with the societal dimensions of dealing with uncertainty. And I actually did that very broadly. So started with being aware that in terms of communication of uncertainty, already people have different understandings of what this uncertainty is, and that we broadened the notion that it also includes different perspectives that experts may have, but also different perspectives on the problem that stakeholders in society may have, and the larger public and politicians. So, so yes, I think that for myself, that has been part of my research portfolio of the last 20 years, and I see more attention being paid to it in general. So it's not just about, can we assess uncertainty in terms of putting down a number or a range for the uncertainty, and then focusing on the reliability of those numbers, but also what does it mean for decision making, or how do people perceive the knowledge they're underpinning, and then the uncertainties as being relevant or not relevant for them dealing with particular risks. So it's a reframing also in terms of what are the problems that people are interested in, what are the risks that they're trying to manage, and then what knowledge comes into that, and then what are the uncertainties in that knowledge. And that's all part of the risk management, in a sense, the risk assessment, risk management that's done in order to proceed. I think that I shifted from over the course of the years from studying uncertainty in scientific practice, to uncertainty in political practice, as well as uncertainty in what you may call religious practice. So opening up this domain, very large domain of religion, where I don't mean organized religion necessarily, but it's all sorts of practices where, in a sense, persons are constituted. So it's not so much about getting information, but it is getting someone to speak to you so that you can become a person. It sounds complicated, but in the end, it's a very basic thing. I'm now studying also animism and totemism in terms of non-Western societies, in terms of what are the uncertainties in those lives, and how do people deal with them. So I'm taking a very wide view now of the basic uncertainties that play a role in people's lives, and then zooming in on science advice in different settings, and how there's intersection between studying uncertainties in the science and what they mean, with actually studying the uncertainties in making political decisions and getting a group behind you, or uncertainties in, well, relating to the meaning of life, if you can put it like that, and how you can kind of become a whole person in a sense, how that all interrelates, and how that affects also how in a particular practice. I've been studying Thailand, for instance, where there is a strong interlinkage between kingship, politics, and Buddhism. And it's a very interesting mix, because there hasn't been a colonized government there. So the government, in a sense, for a long period has been quite unique in terms of how worldview, like Buddhism or religion, if you can call it like that, has been affecting how people, well, make decisions and deal with also scientific uncertainty. And I've been studying foresight in that context. How do people in such a Buddhist society think about progress? Think about scenario thinking, think about managing their delta as a whole using the kind of Dutch delta approach, where we have this kind of Protestant idea that we can engineer our way out of our climate change problems by having all these pathways to the future, and then raising the dikes and the coast, and doing it in a very rational, planned way. Comparing that with, deep down, what are the kind of valid cognitive structures in a decision-making system where Buddhist kingship plays a central role, and there's particular Buddhist ways to make decisions under uncertainty, which are not necessarily the similar kind of decisions on, let's say, dealing with scenarios and finding progress through them, that we find in the Netherlands. Now, these are broad brush statements, and I'm increasingly studying these questions in much more detail in terms of individual projects, also future projects. I want to compare that to discussions in Africa on water management there, discussions between Ethiopia and Egypt and the Nile, but also deep down identity questions. Christianity in the Ethiopian version and its relationship with Egypt is a very important component of that geopolitical debate on the distribution of water. And I want to look more at those intersections to see how do people arrive at their view of what do I want to know from science? How can science help me with dealing with my problems? And there are always ways, I think, science is relevant and engineering is relevant. But there is this lens that you have to apply to it, I think.
That's a very fascinating picture that you are painting. It almost looks like scientific uncertainty is just the tip of an iceberg, where uncertainty plays a much deeper role already in determining the kind of fundamental questions that we ask, the kind of ways of life and intersubjective practices, and like religion and culture are a way of responding to certain uncertainties, and in turn they influence what can be the role of scientific advice within that context. That's very fascinating, I think, and really shows how deep is the role of uncertainty in our cognitive structures.
I agree, and it's well worth examining those deeper interrelationships instead of just focusing on scientific uncertainty.
Well, it would be very fascinating to talk more about this, but let's move to the recent experience of the COVID-19 crisis, which has highlighted, I think, some of the problems and limits of expert advice, especially when scientists get a lot of media exposure and quarrel with each other. A lot of questions about individual responsibility and integrity come to mind, which are, of course, old questions, but they have been brought back. So this reinforces my impression that we need an intermediate category between scientists and policymakers. Some sort of advisors who have enough understanding of science, but who are not involved personally in the research and in the search for funding. So do you think that it is possible to have such a class of advisors that introduces some healthy distance between science and politics, a sort of mediating chamber between these two fields?
In principle, yes, and I have made pleas also for such intermediaries, and we have had the experience and the pleasure in the Netherlands of having, let's say, 70 years of experience with these kind of formal intermediaries at the science policy interface, first starting in economic policy, but then in the 90s broadened to environmental policy with our policy analysis agencies. So you can have boundary organizations, you can have workers in those boundary organizations, but one thing I want to warn against is that you kind of rely very much on a single person for that. So a chief scientific advisor who should kind of know it all. And it's better to have a whole ecosystem of a large group of such workers who kind of are independent in the sense that they're not invested in a particular scientific theory, and they also have a kind of protection. They may be civil servants, but they're not too political, and they're not too much also wedded to a particular policymaking approach. And once you have, as a government, decided as a public administration measure that you need such people and you protect them, you fund them, then it's very useful, I think. And so we have examples of that in the Netherlands. So yeah, you have to be humble enough to do that well. Still, you have to kind of project some authority in the arena where you are advising. So you shouldn't be just a consultant who is just coming in, doesn't really know anything about it, and has some kind of skills in quickly looking at stuff and then summarizing. It's better to have people there who have the credibility and the proven track record and reliability as experts, however you define that. Maybe deeper knowledge in a particular field and then broadening out to other fields. So yes, you need the trust from the side of the receivers, which are the policymakers and the politicians. So it does require, again, proper politics and proper policymaking to make this kind of in-between function work. But I do think everybody is helped by it if people may do careers to become a science advisor. So that's actually why we set up this whole program in London at UCL, these Masters of Public Administration in Science, Technology, Engineering and Public Policy, especially to acknowledge that people may require further professional training to do this role well.
So it's not something easy to set up, and it requires an investment on the part of society, both in creating these types of expertise and in supporting the organizations, the institutions that can nurture this type of work.
Yeah, that's what is needed to make this work.
And are you optimistic about the fact that we can get this, that there are enough motivation for supporting these kind of efforts?
Well, I think there is an increased realization of the need for these kind of intermediaries, also with the many experts disagreeing. I don't think, of course, being a lover of exposure of uncertainty, I didn't have a real trouble myself with the fact that there is this quarrel. The question is, of course, who can reliably, I wouldn't say be an arbiter, but be a commentator, a reflector on these real uncertainties. And in some societies, they have found those commentators, in others they haven't. I'm optimistic that this role of, the role of reflector on the science that goes into decision making, that it's being increasingly acknowledged, that it needs to be institutionalized and funded. Yes.
And coming back to the current crisis, do you think that the fact that science was so much on the news and so much part of dealing with this problem, but science at this stage was very uncertain because what was dealing with a new virus, a new disease, so knowledge was still very much in the making. But the public, in a sense, has been exposed to science in the making. Do you think that this can have had a sort of educational function in making people realize that science advances slowly and first among a lot of ignorance and uncertainty, and perhaps this could have helped the public to understand the need of having this kind of mediation in the use of science, that it's not just something that can provide the question, the answers straight away.
Well, yes and no, because in the end, what you need is some level of what Latour calls purification, in the sense of what do the experts and the intermediaries think is relatively reliable to act on, right? And if you only see people quarreling, you may think, it's just any opinion counts. Well, actually, those scientists are embedded in the practice where a lot of claims are not valid. So you may get a wrong opinion there of everybody can easily participate in that practice, which may not be true. So yes, it is educational to see that at the forefront of research there is this uncertainty, but it's also important to realize that those experts who are having these quarrels, they had many years of training, and they have more in common than they have difference between them. And so you need a kind of subtle balance between that ready-made science and science in the making, as I would put it.
Now I want to ask you a question about the impact of uncertainty on the attempts to anticipate the future, because the project I am coordinating endorses the importance of foresight exercises in order to make innovation more responsible and sustainable. And you have worked on foresight and on some of the limitations of these practices. So I'm very interested in the idea of reflective futures practitioners that you have proposed together with your colleagues. So can you explain what is needed to be reflective in foresight exercises, and what advantages does it bring?
Well, I can give a very short answer there, which is really saying that is not mystical or difficult at all. So what this is about is to organize reflection in your practices. In this case, the practice of foresight. It means avoid groupthink, bring in marginal voices, surprises in your own practices, and organize then interactions with the people who have to use that foresight product. So often when people produce scenarios, they produce scenarios and they're not really doing that together with the people who may be using those scenarios. Well, actually, scenario thinking and foresight exercises, they have to be done with the people who have to make decisions on that basis, and also getting some of their knowledge and their views and their frames into the exercise to make them more usable. But those are all elements of becoming this reflective futures practitioner. And I think in this particular branch of let's say science, many foresight practitioners are aware of it, and so it's not really novel. This is more of a problem with people who haven't really done foresight yet and are suddenly stumbling onto that arena because they have a model that gives a prediction. And they are the ones that have to become more reflective and be part of this larger practice of how you do proper foresight exercises.
And do you think that art and performing art and even play can have a role in introducing a unhealthy level of reflection and distance and breaking with some of the assumptions and the usual way of thinking?
Yeah, I actually think that there are lots of techniques like, I call it a technique, so it sounds a bit instrumental, but techniques like ways to tell stories, ways to bring in art or dance or whatever. There are all sorts. A colleague of mine, Dr. Ellie Cosgrave at UCL, is using dance in designing cities, right? It's part of foresight methodology. So yes, we have to use the whole body in terms of being evoked and being creative, and that's part of the reflection that we need, is that we need all those faculties really.
And one last question, because we are approaching the end of our allotted time. I know that your work on the relation between science and religion has found a lot of inspiration in the American pragmatist William James. And I personally have a lot of sympathy for William James, and I wonder if his ideas can help us today in rethinking the relation between science and religion in a way that can also help us in developing a healthier approach to the use of science in policy. Can you tell us something about this? Do you have some insights to share?
Well, I can share some of my interests in William James, also being a relevant philosopher, writer on questions that we are interested here in terms of the science policy interface. So I'm presently delving into a meta-philosophical question in terms of my own research on the varieties of what you can call naturalism. And I think that's all relevant for dealing with the science policy interface, especially in non-Western contexts where people don't necessarily have a naturalistic view. So James himself was very enthusiastic about natural science. He knew everything about it in his days. He actually knew all about psychology also as a natural scientific field of study. But what he was eager about was to holistic forms of naturalism, so that all meaning in the world should be dependent on the metaphysics based on a very poorly defined naturalism, where you think that that what science is taking for nature, that's all that there is. So I think it's a stupid position to actually take that position, but people still do that. People still think that if you do science, that's a necessity. And some people think if you do science advice, it is a necessity as well. So this is why I think it's relevant to study this a bit more closely. I think with James, the difficulty is he didn't really propose a system of philosophy. He's much too difficult to grasp as a philosopher. And I'm trying to develop some systematic position, which I call transcendental naturalism. I won't define it here, but it's a kind of metaphilosophical position that's also useful for people working at the science policy interface, especially if they have to deal with doing science advice in non-Western contexts. So, yeah, I think William James for me is a very important philosopher to read and reread. But we have to be aware he is working in a setting at the end of the 19th and early 20th century, and we are now, let's say, 120 years further in the future. Yeah, we have to make him relevant if we read him.
So if I can try to synthesize what you've said, do you think that one of the main inspiration that William James can offer us is to be open to accept as natural, as part of our natural humanity, some ways of approaching things and appraising things that are not scientific and not justifiable in any scientific way, but still have something important to say.
So yes, that's one side of the coin, and the other side is, I think the outcomes of scientific research should also be taken seriously, but not in a metaphysical sense. So that's the point. So that's we have to be very careful with making metaphysical conclusions from our models. We have to be very, in philosophy of science terms, we have to be very careful with if we want to be scientific realists, we must be very careful in choosing which scientific realism we think works. And well, that's the subject of a whole other debate, but some choices are actually limiting the voices of non-Western cultures, and I think we should avoid that.
Thank you very much, Arthur. It has been really a pleasure to have you with us and to pick your brain on a broad range of issues, and to see how rich and inspirational your experience is. So thank you again for having shared it with us.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.